Hi, in this video we're going to use trigonometry to work out an unknown side length in a right angle triangle. Now the first thing we did in the first video was to label the sides of this right angle triangle. Now first we're interested in what the angle of interest is here, because we always label the sides relative to an angle of interest. Now the 60 degrees is the angle of interest because it's the angle that's given that is not the right angle. So the angle of interest is never the right angle here, it's always the marked angle here. So that's the angle of interest. And then what we did after was to label the sides. So these are the side lengths of interest. We're given this x and we're given the 11. And how did we label them? Well, we can see here that this x here, that side there, is next to the angle of interest, the 60 degrees. Another word for next to is adjacent to. So remember, this is called the adjacent side, and I label it as an A in a circle. The reason for my circle is just to avoid confusing it with this x here. And then remember the longest side of the triangle, known as the hypotenuse, we can label that with H for hypotenuse. And now, although we didn't use this side, if there was a side length there, this is known as the opposite because it's opposite to this angle of interest. So we would label that as O for opposite, but because there's no side length there, I'm not going to label that. So once you've labeled the sides, that's the first step, you then select the correct trigonometric ratio. Now remember from the previous video that what these trigonometric ratios are is these are kind of like a magic function. Sine, cos and tan are functions which take the angle of interest as the input. Now this letter here is a Greek letter theta. It's in the Greek alphabet. Don't get upset by that. But basically theta is the angle of interest. So that's the 60 degrees here. So theta is just a variable, we could just like x, etc. But we particularly use theta for angles. So these are special magic functions which take an angle of interest as the input and gives you back the ratio of two of the sides of this right angle triangle. Remember, ratio just means the relative size of two things, and you can find the relative size of two things by dividing them. So sine of the angle of interest theta gives you the relative size of the opposite and the hypotenuse, O and H. Cos of the angle gives you the relative size of the adjacent and the hypotenuse, A and H. And tan of the angle gives you the relative size of the opposite and the adjacent. And the way we can remember this is this lovely mnemonic below, which is SOHCAHTOA. SOHCAHTOA, because you can see, if you match this to this, the sine of the angle of interest is the opposite over the hypotenuse, cos of the angle is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tan of the angle is opposite over adjacent. So because we've labelled the sides, we know we're involving the adjacent and the hypotenuse. So if we look through these three, which one of these three involves the adjacent hypotenuse? Well, it's this one. That involves the A and the H. So we start by writing out the formula we want. Cos of theta is equal to A over H. And then the final step is we substitute our values, our angles and our side lengths into that formula. So the theta here was the angle of interest, which is a 60. We've got cos of 60 degrees is equal to the adjacent, A, which is x, and H, which in our diagram is the 11. And we want to get x on its own. Now, x has been divided by 11. We want to get rid of that over 11. So we therefore multiply both sides by 11. When we do that, cos 60 times by 11 is just 11 lots of cos 60. And then x over 11 times by 11, the times by 11 cancels out the over 11, so you just get x. And now you can just put 11 cos 60 on your calculator. You might wonder, like, how does your calculator work out what cos of 60 is? What is it actually doing? And you don't need to worry about that yet. That's something, in fact, you don't cover unless you're doing further maths A level if you happen to be in the UK. So if we do 11 cos 60 on your calculator, it is 5.5. So x is equal to 5.5. What's it in centimeters? So x is 5.5 centimeters, and that is the final answer.